power is coming directly from the PCM. I really like the look of it with it kind of wrapping around. The Hemi engine is running like it should. We got the thing dropped. If you have an engine that has the MDS solenoids in there, this is definitely a step you'll want to take. Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Ask a Tech. Now, the very first thing I want to do here is I want to personally thank each and every one of you who have supported me on my recent move back to Oregon. It really does mean a lot to me. Let's get into our first question. All right, our first question for the day comes from the Sophie and Sean Shipgan page. He says, I'd like to know your opinion on swapping the intake manifold on a 5.7 to a 6.1 or a 6.4. I'm debating between the two and I'm not sure what the difference would be. Now I'm going to make an extreme simplification here, but in general, the longer intake runners you have, you will generate more bottom end torque, but at the cost of higher end horsepower. But with shorter intake runners, you're gonna make more higher end horsepower, but you're gonna do it at the cost of bottom end torque. So that's what we're seeing with a 5.7 intake. And that's also why people wanna switch over to the 6.1 intake, because the story out there is that you can make a little bit more power up top if you have a 6.1 intake. Now, I've seen a few dyno graphs online, and it looks like that is true, that the 6.1 will make you more horsepower up top, but it's not a great amount, maybe like 5 or 6, but it does so at the cost of a huge chunk of torque down at the bottom end. And for me, that's just not acceptable. That's not something I'm willing to compromise on, because especially if something's your daily driver, that torque is where a lot of your driving experience comes from. So that is not the solution for me. Now, what is the solution then? Well, that's where the 6.4 liter intake manifold comes into play. That is absolutely the intake that I would recommend. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it's made out of that composite or plastic material. It's not made out of aluminum like the 6.1, because that aluminum intake heat soaks like crazy. And to me, that would just mitigate any of the power gains that you may have gotten from that anyway. Now, if you think about it just like variable cam timing, basically you can change your cam timing to generate either more torque or more horsepower. It's the exact same situation with a 6.4 manifold, because it has a short runner valve actuator on it, where it opens up some flaps inside the intake manifold to switch between longer runners and shorter runners. So you have the best of both worlds. Now the question is, can you just bolt a 392 intake directly onto your 5.7 and have it work? Well, the answer to that is no, it does not, because while it will physically bolt up, you have no way of actually actuating it between the short runners and the longer runners. Let me tell you, if you bolt that thing on and don't have any way to actuate it, there's really no point in doing the mod. So you have to have a way to actuate it. Now, I'm sure there's a way you could scab something together, some way to make it work, but there's a company called Modern Muscle Extreme who have already done the hard work for you. They have created a short runner valve actuator controller that you can just bolt right into place, and it'll automatically actuate it at the 4,900 RPM, I believe, is the switchover point. And I think the actuator, let's see, on the website was $289.99, so $290 for the actuator. Then you have to buy the manifold as well. So if you can get through this thing at about $800-ish, somewhere around there, I think that's a pretty good deal, because based on the information I'm reading online, it's talking an increase of 15 to 18 wheel horsepower just through this one mod. And for me, as simple as it is to change over an intake manifold, I think that's a pretty worthwhile modification to do, and it's something I'm planning to do myself. On my own personal vehicle, that 86 C10 that I have a 392 engine in, the 392 engine came out of a truck version, so it had the truck manifold on there, which I've also heard good things about that manifold. However, the outlet comes up, and I dislike where that manifold outlet is. So I went with the stock 5.7 intake manifold, and that was a great regret of mine. I think I'm absolutely killing the horsepower of that thing by having that manifold on there. So I want to swap this thing over to a 392 manifold, and I think I can actually control that short runner valve using the Holley Terminator X. So I would love to do a before and after power comparison of this thing to see exactly what sort of difference it makes. But for me personally, that is what I would suggest. Go with the 6.4 intake manifold. Now, obviously, you are going to have to change out your intake tube and maybe your air box to actually match up with all of this stuff, but I believe it all just bolts right into place, no issue. Moment to Forever says, I have a 2013 Ram 1500 with a 6-speed automatic transmission. It throws a P0740 code at around 40 miles an hour after the transmission is at normal operating temperature. I took it to a transmission shop and they did the oil and filter and valve body service, but it didn't resolve the issue. They said that they would have to pull the transmission to investigate further. The error doesn't affect drivability, and I've continued to drive regularly. What would you advise as the next step, and have you seen this issue? Yes, I have seen this issue. Generally, we see it more with the 2500s than with the 1500s. But what's happening here is that code P0740 is a TCC solenoid circuit. And I believe that's a very misleading name for that code because it makes you think that there's an issue with the solenoid, and that is not true. What it's saying is it's seeing your torque converter slipping. That's what the actual code means. And so what we see here is that your torque converter lockup isn't actually holding firm anymore, and you're getting a little bit of slippage in there. Now there is a negative effect to this. So even though the vehicle drives okay, you're gonna generate some excessive heat in there because really the transmissions work best when the torque converter is able to fully lock up. If it's constantly slipping, you're gonna keep generating more and more heat. Now, areas in which this is really going to become an issue is when you are towing, because again, that torque converter will not be able to fully lock, and it's gonna slip even more with a heavier load behind it, and it's gonna get real hot, and that's when it's gonna cause some real issues. So the fix for this, unfortunately, is just replacing the torque converter. But that would absolutely be my recommendation if this is a vehicle you're going to be holding on to long term. Go ahead and slap a new torque converter in there, you'll be good to go. All right, our next question comes from Spencer Ellis. He says, I personally have worked on the early Gen 3 Hemi and have only done a few major repairs on the later Eagle Hemi. My question to you is, which do you prefer is better? Since I've seen the later engines have so many failures with camshaft and lifters, but the early generation had valve seat issues, it's kind of hard for me to decide which I prefer better, but I want to see your opinion. That's actually a great question, and for me personally, I know that the later engines make more power. That's just the truth of it. They have a better design. But I personally like the early engines, and the reason why is because there's just not that much to go wrong with them. Like he said, if you go ahead and swap out the cylinder heads for a set of reman units, you don't have to worry about that valve seat issue anymore, and they're actually really solid overall. They don't have VVT, so they don't have that same power, but you don't have VVT, so you don't have that problem of dealing with it. And also on the later Hemi engines, if you add a performance camshaft in there, a lot of times you have to either limit or lock out the VVT anyway. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense there. So my personal favorite, I do like the 06 engines. I think they're very, very simplistic. And my preferred way to make horsepower on an engine, if I want to make like actual horsepower, bolt-ons don't make a lot of sense to me. I am a big fan of forced induction, whether it be turbocharging or supercharging. To me, per dollar, it only makes sense to go with boost. And that being the case, I want my engine to be as simple as possible. I want there to be as least failure points as possible. So for me, I love the 06 model engine because it does not have that VVT in there. I can go ahead and block off the MDS system on there. So I like that setup myself personally, and you're gonna see that fairly soon here. I am working on a boosted application. Next up, RGXX asks, at what mileage is time to change a timing chain on 5.7 Hemi? It says the 2005 user manual only has info about 2.7 and 3.5s, but no word about the 5.7. And do we have to change it if there's no rattling noise from the chain and tensioner? You are correct, there is no actual service interval for changing that timing chain. And to be honest, I've worked on many 180,000 mile, 200,000 mile Hemis where that timing chain is exactly the same length overall as a brand spanking new one. So they're not really a wear item. Now that being the case, if I were working on one personally and it had over 150,000 miles, I would think about changing it because honestly, they're very cheap overall to get a new set, timing chain and sprockets. They're not very expensive. So for me, if it's over 150,000 miles, that's something I would be doing while I was in there. If it's only got like 100,000 miles or 120,000 miles, it doesn't make a ton of sense for me to change it out. And also, to be clear, I've only ever seen in my entire 11-year career of being a Dodge tech, I've only ever seen one broken timing chain on a Hemi. Next question, Tucker Cord says, I've mostly done repair work on Dodges myself, but you have done other brands. How would you say they compare? For example, I took a door panel off a Nissan 350Z to fix the power window motor. There were probably 20 bolts, whereas on a domestic car, there probably would have been 5. And a Ford 4.6 I'm working on now has 8mm bolts, where Dodge would have 10mm. Just curious what you've noticed, since I think you wrench a lot more than me. Tucker, I think that all of the car companies are regressing towards the mean. And what I mean by that is they're all starting to share more suppliers, they're all starting to share more supply lines, all of that sort of thing. So they're all becoming more and more and more similar to each other. And it's weird because I've seen this among the domestic brands, the German brands, the Japanese brands. They're all heading that exact same direction. It's really a global market now. There's not really this kind of separation that there really was before. So I think it's been very interesting because, like you say, I'll pull apart something from a German manufacturer and it ends up being very similar to what I see from the Japanese manufacturers, and even the US manufacturers are all heading that direction. I don't necessarily know if I think it's a good thing, because I think really they should be designing things to be really different from each other, but it's not financially viable for them to do that anymore. So I really think that's why they're all kind of regressing towards this area where they have so much similarities now. A good friend, Summer Smith, asks, I'd like to ask a mechanic, how do I remove a broken dipstick? I thought this was actually a good one to have in here because it's actually really common with the Dodge vehicles for those dipsticks to break off inside the tube, and it's a huge pain trying to get those things out. I'm going to share with you my method. It may not be the best method you've ever heard, but it is my method. So basically, because the top of the dipstick is still stuck inside the tube and it's made out of that kind of plasticky material, I'll take a little 1/16 drill bit and I'll drill down through the plastic, straight down through the plastic till I get all the way through, trying to keep as little of that plastic out of there as you can. You don't really want it falling into your oil pan. But drill a hole down in there, and then you'll take a pick, a really sharp pick, and just jam it in that little hole you drilled, and then you can kind of yank out what's left of that dipstick in there. It's a pain, it's not that easy to do, but it's one of the best solutions I've found for getting those things out, because sometimes those dipsticks are really stuck in there. That's why they get broken off in the first place. Or you just have a lazy lube tech who sticks it in there and just rams it home and snaps it off and says, well, whatever, see you later. VR asks, would there be a benefit to an oil filter relocation kit in going to a full-size filter? I did this on my Ram 1500 Classic Hemi since the stock filter seems inadequate. With a full-size filter, I have more filtration, more oil capacity, oil temp is about 2 to 3 degrees cooler, and the pressure is still normal. It's also easier to pull the filter now. I would say you pretty much answered your question right there. I think, is it necessary? No, I don't think it's necessary at all, but I do think there's a lot of benefits to be had. Anytime you have an oil filter relocation kit, you're automatically generating more volume of oil, which, as you mentioned, is going to keep your oil just a little bit cooler on there. As far as the larger filter providing more filtration, okay, that's probably true, but the primary benefit that I can see is just relocating the oil filter, period. That oil filter is in a terrible spot in those Ram trucks, directly above your steering rack. It gets oil all over the steering rack and it is almost impossible to get it all clean afterwards. What a pain that setup is. I would relocate it just for that. Now, speaking of a Holley Terminator, our next question comes from Tristan Russello. He says, I've shared a few posts about my Hemi stroker build on my 08 Ram. Similar builds are pushing 650 horsepower on a Holley Terminator from a crate. Do I need a custom ECU for this build, or is the 08 Ram one good enough? Some advice I'm having trouble believing is that stock ECUs are good to tune to 1,000 horsepower. I've also heard that Dodge ECUs are better than many others. Is there any advantage to the Holley Terminator in my build? Is it just extra expense? Can it do on-the-fly tune changes, like tuning from race to eco-tune without powering down the vehicle? Could the Dodge one do that with some programming magic? If I did install the Terminator, I see it has a CAN bus hookup, so would it integrate with the system of my truck? Throw in codes or in the dash, etc.? Would it replace the stock ECU, or would the stock ECU be left in to make the CAN bus system happen? I like options and features. If it can do something for me, I'm happy to buy it. Just give me a reason. This is actually a really good question, and one specifically that I would say, if you are already working with an engine that's designed to go in that vehicle, like you already have your Hemi engine in a Dodge-based vehicle, I think it makes more sense to go with a company like HP Tuners or something like that to make those modifications to the PCM. I really do, because then you do keep all your standard features and everything else in the truck actually works like it's supposed to. In my mind, if you're swapping an engine into a vehicle that does not belong and your CAN bus systems and everything isn't going to work anyway, that's when it makes more sense to go with a full standalone like the Holley Terminator. Now, the Terminator does have all sorts of features and all sorts of inputs and outputs and everything to where you can really change some things up and do really neat things. But I don't necessarily think it offsets the effect of just using HP tuners and keeping your stock ECU so that everything else works on your vehicle. I really, really like that Terminator setup, but to me it just makes more sense if you're swapping an engine into a vehicle that doesn't belong in it at all. And also, I'm not currently aware that the Terminator has any way of actually interfacing with Dodge CAN bus based systems. I think it has a CAN bus setup, but only for its own features, or clicking into like the coded digital gauges or something like that. I don't think it will directly interface with Dodge stuff this time. Go ahead and correct me if I'm wrong. All right, you guys, that is going to do it for this episode of Ask a Tech. As always, if you want your question answered, go ahead and post the reply in the pinned comment down below, and we will see you next time on Reignited.